The air in the shadowy realm was thick with an oppressive energy, a miasma of cursed energy that seemed to pulse like a living entity. The sky above was a swirling vortex of darkness, streaked with faint, ghostly lights that flickered like dying embers. The ground beneath Yuji Itadori's feet was uneven, a jagged expanse of blackened stone that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. This was no ordinary battlefield, it was a cursed domain, a place where the rules of reality bent and twisted under the weight of malevolent power. Yuji stood at the center of it all, his fists clenched, his breathing steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. Across from him, the Mirror Queen loomed, her form a shimmering, ethereal figure that seemed to shift and distort with every movement. Her presence was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a perfect reflection of the duality of cursed energy itself. The Mirror Queen was no ordinary curse. She was a special grade, a being of immense power who had carved out her own domain within the shadows. Her ability was as enigmatic as her appearance. She could manipulate reflections, bending light and perception to her will. Her attacks were unpredictable, her defenses nearly impenetrable. But Yuji wasn't alone. Beside him stood Megumi Fushiguro, his expression calm but focused, his hands already forming the intricate hand signs necessary to summon his Shikigami. Nobara Kujisaki stood a few paces behind, her hammer resting on her shoulder, her nails clutched tightly in her other hand. The trio had faced countless curses before, but this was different. This was a fight that would test not only their strength but their resolve. The Mirror Queen's laughter echoed through the realm, a sound that was both melodic and chilling. "You've come far, little sorcerers," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "But do you truly believe you can defeat me? In my domain, I am untouchable." Yuji's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew better than to engage in a battle of words with a curse. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, his mind racing through the possibilities. He had to find a way to break through her defenses, to land a hit that would disrupt her control over the domain. But how? Megumi was the first to act. With a swift motion, he summoned Nu, the thunderous Shikigami that crackled with electricity. The massive bird-like creature soared into the air, its wings casting shadows that seemed to warp under the Mirror Queen's influence. Nu dove toward her, its talons crackling with energy, but the Mirror Queen simply raised a hand. The air around her shimmered, and suddenly Nu's attack was reflected back at it. The Shikigami screeched as it was struck by its own lightning, its form dissipating into smoke. Megumi gritted his teeth, his mind working quickly to adapt. "Her reflection ability isn't just defensive," he muttered. "She can redirect attacks. We need to find a way to bypass it." Nobara stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. "If she can reflect attacks, then we need to hit her with something she can't predict," she said, her voice steady. She raised her hammer, and with a swift motion, she drove a nail into the air. The sound of clapping echoed as the resonance technique activated, sending a shockwave of cursed energy toward the Mirror Queen. But once again, the curse raised her hand, and the attack was reflected back. Nobara barely managed to dodge the returning energy, her expression tightening with frustration. "Damn it," she muttered. "She's too fast." Yuji watched the exchange, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't rely solely on brute strength. The Mirror Queen's ability made her a formidable opponent, but there had to be a weakness. He glanced at Megumi, who was already summoning another Shikigami, this time, the twin wolves, divine dogs. The creatures lunged forward, their movements swift and precise, but the Mirror Queen simply waved her hand, and the wolves' attacks were reflected back at them. Megumi's expression darkened as the Shikigami were forced to retreat. "We need to change tactics," he said, his voice low. "If we can't hit her directly, we'll have to disrupt her domain." Yuji nodded, his fists tightening. "Leave that to me," he said, his voice filled with determination. He took a deep breath, focusing his cursed energy. The air around him seemed to ripple as he activated his innate technique, Divergent Fist. His movements became a blur as he charged toward the Mirror Queen, his fists glowing with cursed energy. She raised her hand to reflect his attack, but Yuji feinted at the last moment, shifting his weight and delivering a powerful kick to her side. The impact sent her skidding backward, her form flickering for a brief moment. Yuji didn't let up. He pressed the attack, his fists a flurry of motion, each strike aimed at disrupting her concentration. The Mirror Queen's expression shifted from amusement to irritation as she struggled to keep up with his relentless assault. But she wasn't defeated yet. With a flick of her wrist, she summoned a wall of mirrors that surrounded Yuji, trapping him in a maze of reflections. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around as he tried to find an exit. But the mirrors seemed to shift and change, distorting his perception of space. The Mirror Queen's laughter echoed through the maze, her voice taunting him. "You're strong, little sorcerer," she said. But strength alone won't save you here. Yuji clenched his fists, his mind racing. He couldn't let her control the battlefield. He had to find a way out. Outside the maze, Megumi and Nobara were working together to disrupt the Mirror Queen's domain. Megumi summoned his domain expansion, Chimera Shadow Garden, the shadows around him twisting and shifting as the domain took shape. The Mirror Queen's expression faltered for a moment as she felt the shift in the cursed energy. You think you can challenge my domain with your own? She sneered, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Nobara took advantage of the distraction, driving another nail into the air and activating resonance once more. This time, the shockwave struck the Mirror Queen directly, causing her form to flicker and distort. She let out a cry of frustration, her control over the maze wavering. Inside the maze, Yuji felt the shift in the cursed energy. The mirrors around him began to crack, their reflections shattering into fragments. He saw his opportunity and took it, channeling all of his cursed energy into a single, devastating punch. The force of the blow shattered the remaining mirrors, freeing him from the maze. He emerged just as the Mirror Queen was recovering from Nobara's attack, her form still flickering. Yuji didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his fists glowing with cursed energy, and delivered a final, powerful strike that sent the Mirror Queen crashing to the ground. The shadowy realm began to dissolve, the oppressive energy fading as the Mirror Queen's domain collapsed. Yuji stood over her, his breathing heavy but his expression determined. The Mirror Queen's form flickered one last time before dissipating into nothingness, her laughter echoing faintly in the air. This isn't over, her voice whispered, a chilling reminder of the larger threat that loomed on the horizon. As the trio regrouped, the weight of their victory was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The Mirror Queen had been a formidable opponent, but she was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara exchanged glances, their resolve stronger than ever. They knew that the battles ahead would be even more challenging, but they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came their way, no matter how dark the shadows grew. The air in the shadowy realm was thick with tension, a suffocating miasma that seemed to cling to every breath Yuji Itadori took. The Mirror Queen loomed before him, her form shimmering like liquid mercury, her eyes reflecting not just his image but his deepest fears. The battle from Part 1 had left both combatants battered but unbroken, and now, as the echoes of their earlier clash faded, a new layer of danger began to unfold. From the corner of his eye, Yuji noticed movement, a flicker of cursed energy that didn't belong to the Mirror Queen. His instinct screamed at him to turn, but the Queen's laughter, cold and mocking, rooted him in place. "You're not the only one who's been busy, sorcerer," she hissed, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. Before Yuji could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, their presence radiating malice. It was a cursed spirit, but unlike any Yuji had faced before. Its form was jagged and asymmetrical, its movements erratic, and its aura reeked of betrayal. Yuji's heart sank as he recognized the cursed energy. It was familiar, too familiar. This spirit had been created by someone he knew, someone he trusted. "Megumi?" Yuji whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling energy in the air. The cursed spirit tilted its head, as if recognizing the name, but its expression remained blank, devoid of humanity. Yuji's mind raced. Had Megumi been compromised? Was this a trap from the start? The questions swirled in his head, but there was no time to dwell on them. The Mirror Queen lunged, her movements a blur of reflected light, and Yuji barely managed to dodge, his body moving on autopilot. He countered with a punch infused with cursed energy, but the Queen's form rippled like water, dispersing the impact harmlessly. The cursed spirit, meanwhile, began to circle them, its jagged limbs scraping against the ground, leaving deep gouges in the shadowy floor. Yuji knew he couldn't fight both at once, not without a plan. He needed to buy time, to think. "Divergent fist," he shouted, channeling his cursed energy into a delayed strike. His fist connected with the Mirror Queen's chest, and for a moment, it seemed to stagger her. But then she smiled, a cruel, knowing smile, and Yuji felt the delayed impact of his own attack reverberate through his body. He gasped, stumbling back, as the Queen laughed. "Your strength is mine to wield," she taunted. "Every blow you land only feeds me." Yuji gritted his teeth, his mind racing. If direct attacks were useless, he needed to find another way. He glanced at the cursed spirit, which was now closing in, its jagged claws extended. The spirit's movements were erratic, but there was a pattern, a rhythm to its attacks. Yuji's training kicked in, and he began to analyze its behavior. It was drawn to cursed energy, feeding off it like a parasite. If he could lure it into the Queen's attacks, maybe he could turn them against each other. The Mirror Queen, however, seemed to anticipate his plan. You think you can outwit me, boy? She sneered, her form shifting into a mirror image of Yuji himself. She mimicked his movements perfectly, her cursed energy flaring in sync with his. Yuji felt a chill run down his spine. Fighting her was like fighting himself, and every move he made only strengthened her. The cursed spirit, now fully engaged, lashed out at both of them, its claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. Yuji ducked and weaved, using the environment to his advantage. He kicked off a jagged rock formation, using the momentum to launch himself at the spirit, but the queen intercepted him, her mirror-like body deflecting his attack. The battle became a chaotic dance of light and shadow, each combatant trying to outmaneuver the others. Yuji's breath came in ragged gasps, his body aching from the relentless assault. He needed help, but there was no one else here, just him, the Mirror Queen, and the cursed spirit. Or so he thought. A sudden burst of cursed energy erupted from the shadows, and Yuji's heart leapt as a familiar voice rang out. Black flash. The attack struck the cursed spirit, sending it reeling, and Yuji turned to see Megumi Fushiguro stepping into the fray, his expression grim but determined. Megumi, Yuji exclaimed, relief flooding through him. But Megumi's eyes were cold, his gaze fixed on the cursed spirit. This isn't the time for reunions, he said sharply. That thing, it's not just a cursed spirit. It's a manifestation of someone's betrayal. We need to take it down, now. Yuji nodded, his resolve hardening. Together, they turned to face their enemies, their movements synchronized despite the tension between them. The Mirror Queen, sensing the shift in the battle, let out a shriek of rage, her form distorting as she prepared to unleash her full power. The cursed spirit, now recovering from Megumi's attack, let out a guttural roar, its jagged limbs flailing wildly. Yuji and Megumi exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They couldn't afford to hold back. Domain expansion, Chimera Shadow Garden, Megumi declared, his voice steady as the shadows around them came alive, twisting and writhing into monstrous forms. The cursed spirit was immediately ensnared, its movement slowed by the encroaching darkness. Yuji seized the opportunity, channeling all his cursed energy into his fists. Divergent fist, maximum output, he shouted, unleashing a barrage of punches that struck the spirit with devastating force. The Mirror Queen, however, was not so easily subdued. She retaliated with a wave of mirrored shards, each one reflecting Yuji's own attacks back at him. Yuji dodged and deflected, his movements fueled by sheer willpower. Megumi, meanwhile, focused on maintaining his domain, his hands trembling with the effort. Yuji, we need to end this quickly. He called out, his voice strained. Yuji nodded, his mind racing. The queen's power was tied to reflection. If they could disrupt that, maybe they could weaken her. An idea sparked in Yuji's mind. Megumi, cover me, he shouted, charging toward the queen. Megumi didn't hesitate, summoning a swarm of shadow creatures to distract her. Yuji reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, jagged shard of cursed energy he had collected earlier. It was unstable, but it might be enough. He hurled it at the queen, aiming for her core. The shard struck true, embedding itself in her mirrored form. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening crack, the queen's form began to fracture, her reflection splintering into 1,000 pieces. The cursed spirit, sensing its creator's distress, let out a final, ear-piercing scream before disintegrating into nothingness. The shadowy realm began to collapse, the walls crumbling as the Mirror Queen's power waned. Yuji and Megumi stood amidst the chaos, their bodies battered but unbroken. As the realm dissolved around them, Yuji turned to Megumi, his expression a mix of relief and suspicion. You knew about that spirit, didn't you? He asked, his voice low. Megumi hesitated, then nodded. I did, he admitted. But I didn't have a choice. Someone's been manipulating us from the start, and I had to play along to uncover the truth. Yuji's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. We'll talk about this later, he said, his tone firm. Right now, we need to get out of here. Megumi nodded, and together, they stepped through the fading remnants of the shadowy realm, their bond tested but not broken. The battle was over, but the stakes had never been higher. Betrayal loomed on the horizon, and Yuji knew that the challenges ahead would require more than just strength, they would require trust, and that was something he wasn't sure he could give. Yuji Itadori stood in the shadowy realm, his breath ragged, his fists clenched as he faced the Mirror Queen. The air was thick with cursed energy, the ground beneath his feet shimmering like liquid obsidian. The Mirror Queen, a towering figure with a body of fractured glass and eyes that reflected infinite voids, loomed before him. Her laughter echoed like shattering crystal, each note sending ripples through the cursed realm. Yuji's muscles tensed as he prepared to strike, but before he could move, a new presence entered the fray. From the shadows emerged a figure cloaked in a tattered black robe, their face obscured by a mask carved with intricate runes. The newcomer moved with an eerie grace, their steps silent yet deliberate. Yuji's instinct screamed at him to be cautious. This wasn't an ally, at least, not one he could trust. The Mirror Queen's laughter faltered for a moment as she turned her gaze toward the intruder. "Who dares intrude upon my domain?" she hissed, her voice a cacophony of broken glass. The masked figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they raised a hand, and the air around them crackled with cursed energy. Yuji's eyes widened as he felt the sheer intensity of their power. This wasn't just any sorcerer, this was someone on a completely different level. The figure's voice finally broke the silence, low and measured. "I've come to claim what's mine," they said, their words carrying an unsettling weight. "The Mirror Queen's power belongs to me." Yuji's mind raced. Who was this person, and why were they after the Mirror Queen? He glanced at his teammates, Megumi and Nobara, who stood nearby, their expressions equally wary. Megumi's shadows flickered around him, ready to strike, while Nobara gripped her hammer and nails tightly. The dynamics of the battle had shifted, and not in their favor. The newcomer was a wild card, and Yuji had no idea if they were an ally, a rival, or something far more dangerous. The Mirror Queen sneered, her glassy form shimmering with rage. "You think you can take my power? Foolish mortal." She lunged at the masked figure, her jagged arms slicing through the air like blades. The figure didn't flinch. With a flick of their wrist, they summoned a barrier of cursed energy, deflecting the queen's attack with ease. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the realm, forcing Yuji and his friends to brace themselves. Yuji knew they couldn't afford to stand idle. "We need to move," he shouted, darting forward to flank the Mirror Queen. Megumi and Nobara followed suit, their movements synchronized from countless battles together. Megumi summoned his divine dogs, the shadowy creatures lunging at the queen's legs to slow her down. Nobara hurled a nail infused with cursed energy, aiming for the queen's fractured torso. The nail struck true, embedding itself in the glass and causing a web of cracks to spread across her form. But the Mirror Queen wasn't so easily defeated. With a roar, she shattered the nail and sent shards of glass flying in all directions. Yuji raised his arms to shield his face, feeling the sharp edges cut into his skin. He gritted his teeth and charged forward, channeling cursed energy into his fists. "Divergent fist," he shouted, delivering a powerful blow to the queen's side. The impact sent her staggering, but she quickly recovered, her form reforming as if the damage had never occurred. The masked figure watched the battle unfold with an air of detachment, their hands clasped behind their back. "You're wasting your energy," they said, their tone almost mocking. "The Mirror Queen cannot be defeated by brute force alone. She is a reflection of your own fears and weaknesses. To destroy her, you must first confront what lies within." Yuji's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, dodging another swipe from the queen's glassy claws. The figure tilted their head, their mask glinting in the dim light. "You'll see soon enough," they replied cryptically. With that, they raised their hand once more, and the air around them began to distort. Yuji felt a sudden pull, as if the very fabric of the realm was being twisted. The Mirror Queen let out a scream of rage, her form flickering as the newcomer's power took hold. Megumi's voice cut through the chaos. "Yuji, we need to focus. This isn't just about the Mirror Queen anymore." Yuji nodded, his mind racing. The masked figure's presence had thrown everything into disarray. Their motives were unclear, and their power was immense. If they turned on the group, they'd be in serious trouble. But for now, the Mirror Queen was still the immediate threat. Nobara, ever the pragmatist, took charge. "We'll handle the queen. You deal with the new guy," she said, pointing at Yuji. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Got it. Be careful," he said, turning to face the masked figure. As he approached, the figure turned to him, their masked face unreadable. "You're persistent," they said, their voice tinged with amusement. "But persistence alone won't save you." Yuji didn't respond. Instead, he launched himself at the figure, his fists glowing with cursed energy. The figure sidestepped his attack with ease, their movements almost preternatural. Yuji pivoted and struck again, but the figure deflected his blow with a casual wave of their hand. "You're strong," they admitted, "but strength without purpose is meaningless." The word struck a chord within Yuji, but he pushed the thought aside. He couldn't afford to be distracted. He feinted left, then swung a powerful kick aimed at the figure's midsection. This time, his attack connected, but the figure barely flinched. Instead, they grabbed his leg and flung him across the realm with terrifying force. Yuji slammed into the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He groaned, struggling to his feet as the figure approached. "You're not ready," the figure said, their voice cold. "But perhaps you will be, in time." With that, they turned and walked away, their form dissolving into the shadows. Yuji stared after them, his mind reeling. Who were they, and what did they want? Before he could ponder further, a cry from Nobara snapped him back to reality. The Mirror Queen was gaining the upper hand, her attacks growing more ferocious. Yuji shook off his confusion and rejoined the fight, his resolve stronger than ever. The battle was far from over, and the addition of the masked figure had only complicated things. But one thing was clear, Yuji and his friends would need to dig deeper than ever before if they hoped to survive. The Shadowy realm was a place of illusions and hidden truths, and the Mirror Queen was just the beginning. The real challenge lay in confronting the fears and weaknesses within themselves. And as the masked figure had so ominously hinted, that was a battle no amount of brute force could win. Yuji fights the Mirror Queen in a shadowy realm. Jujutsu Kaisen, Part 4. The air in the shadowy realm was thick with cursed energy, a suffocating miasma that clung to Yuji's lungs as he squared off against the Mirror Queen. Her form shimmered like liquid mercury, her movements fluid and unpredictable, as though she were a reflection that refused to stay still. Yuji's fists crackled with cursed energy, his breathing steady despite the mounting pressure. He had faced countless curses before, but this was different. The Mirror Queen wasn't just powerful, she was cunning, her every move calculated to exploit his weaknesses. The battle had been raging for what felt like hours, though time in this realm was impossible to measure. Yuji's muscles burned, his stamina pushed to its limits, but he refused to back down. Megumi and Nobara fought alongside him, their combined efforts keeping the Queen's relentless attacks at bay. Megumi's Shikigami darted through the shadows, their forms flickering like ghosts, while Nobara's nails and hammer struck with precision, each hit resonating with a satisfying crack. Yet, despite their teamwork, the Mirror Queen seemed untouchable. Every blow they landed shattered her form, only for her to reform moments later, her laughter echoing through the void. "She's toying with us," Yuji muttered, wiping blood from his lip. "We need to figure out her weakness, or this is never going to end." Megumi nodded, his expression grim. "Her power is tied to this realm. As long as we're here, she can keep regenerating. We need to disrupt the connection." Before they could strategize further, the Mirror Queen lunged at them, her movements a blur of silver and shadow. Yuji barely managed to dodge, her claws grazing his arm and leaving a deep gash. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They couldn't keep this up forever. Then, in a moment of desperation, Nobara made a bold move. She stepped forward, her hammer raised high, and drove a nail into her own hand. Blood dripped onto the ground as she activated her resonance technique, aiming to strike at the Queen's core. The Mirror Queen faltered for the first time, her form flickering as the attack connected. But before Nobara could press her advantage, the Queen retaliated with a devastating blast of cursed energy, sending Nobara flying across the battlefield. "Nobara," Yuji shouted, his heart pounding as he rushed to her side. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The sight of her injured form filled him with a mix of anger and guilt. He had promised to protect his friends, and yet here they were, on the brink of defeat. It was then that the Mirror Queen spoke, her voice a haunting melody that sent chills down Yuji's spine. "You fight so valiantly, but it's futile. Your strength, your determination, it's all a reflection of your own limitations. You cannot defeat me, for I am the embodiment of your deepest fears." Her words struck a chord within Yuji, stirring something he had tried to bury. The memory of Sukuna's presence, the weight of the cursed spirit's power lurking within him, threatened to surface. He clenched his fists, forcing the thought aside. Now wasn't the time to dwell on his own demons. Megumi stepped forward, his hands forming a series of intricate seals. "Yuji, I have an idea, but it's risky. I need you to buy me some time." Yuji nodded without hesitation, his resolve hardening. "Do what you need to do. I'll keep her busy." As Megumi began his preparations, Yuji charged at the Mirror Queen, his cursed energy flaring to life. The battle intensified, each clash of their power sending shockwaves through the realm. Yuji fought with everything he had, his movements fueled by sheer willpower. But the Queen was relentless, her attacks growing more ferocious with each passing moment. Just as Yuji began to falter, Megumi's voice rang out. "Now!" Yuji leapt back, his body aching from the strain, as Megumi unleashed his domain expansion, Chimera Shadow Garden. The realm around them shifted, the shadows twisting and contorting as Megumi's Shikigami emerged in full force. The Mirror Queen's form wavered, her connection to the realm disrupted by the overwhelming cursed energy. "This is our chance," Yuji shouted, his fists glowing with cursed energy as he prepared to deliver the final blow. But before he could strike, the Mirror Queen's laughter filled the air once more. "You think this changes anything? You're still trapped in my world." With a wave of her hand, the realm began to collapse, the ground cracking and splintering beneath their feet. Yuji and Megumi exchanged a panicked glance, realizing the gravity of the situation. If the realm collapsed, they would be trapped in the void, lost forever. In that moment of desperation, Yuji made a decision. He turned to Megumi, his expression resolute. "Get Nobara out of here. I'll hold her off." Megumi hesitated, his loyalty to his friends warring with his sense of duty. "Yuji, you can't. There's no time." Yuji interrupted, his voice firm. "I'll find another way. Just go." Reluctantly, Megumi nodded, his hands forming a seal as he summoned his Shikigami to carry Nobara to safety. As they disappeared into the shadows, Yuji turned to face the Mirror Queen, his fists raised. The queen smirked, her form shimmering with renewed strength. "Such bravery. But it will be your undoing." Yuji didn't respond. Instead, he focused all of his energy into one final attack, his cursed energy surging to unprecedented levels. The Mirror Queen's eyes widened in surprise as he charged at her, his movements a blur of speed and power. Their clash was cataclysmic, the force of their collision shaking the very fabric of the realm. Yuji's fists connected with the queen's form, shattering her into countless shards of light. But as the dust settled, he realized the cost of his victory. The realm was collapsing around him, the void closing in. As darkness enveloped him, Yuji felt a strange sense of peace. He had protected his friends, even if it meant sacrificing himself. But just as he prepared to accept his fate, a familiar voice echoed in his mind. "You're not done yet, brat." Sukuna's presence surged within him, his cursed energy flaring to life. Yuji's eyes snapped open as the void around him began to shift, the realm reforming under the influence of Sukuna's power. The Mirror Queen's shattered form began to coalesce once more, her expression one of pure rage. "You," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. Yuji smirked, his body coursing with newfound strength. "Looks like the tables have turned." The battle resumed, but this time, Yuji fought with a ferocity that surpassed his previous limits. Sukuna's power was a double-edged sword, but for now, Yuji wielded it with precision. The Mirror Queen's attacks grew desperate, her form flickering as Yuji's blows landed with devastating force. Finally, with one last, earth-shattering punch, Yuji shattered the Mirror Queen's core, her form dissolving into nothingness. The realm began to collapse once more, but this time, Yuji was ready. With Sukuna's power coursing through him, he tore through the void, emerging back into the real world. As he collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but alive, Yuji couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The Mirror Queen was defeated, but at what cost? Sukuna's influence was growing stronger, and Yuji knew that his battle was far from over. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of respite, his thoughts turning to his friends. They were safe, and that was all that mattered. The rest could wait. The air in the shadowy realm was thick with cursed energy, a suffocating miasma that made every breath feel like a struggle. Yuji Itadori stood at the edge of a crumbling cliff, his fists clenched and his eyes locked on the towering figure of the Mirror Queen. Her reflective surface shimmered with an otherworldly glow, distorting the landscape around her into a kaleidoscope of fractured images. The stakes had never been higher. The Mirror Queen had revealed her true power, the ability to trap her opponents in an endless labyrinth of reflections, forcing them to confront their darkest fears and most painful memories. Yuji and his allies were already battered and exhausted, but they couldn't afford to falter now. The clock was ticking, every second they spent in this realm brought them closer to being consumed by its malevolent energy. Megumi Fushiguro crouched beside Yuji, his shadows writhing like restless serpents around him. "We can't keep fighting her head on," he said, his voice strained. "She's too strong, and this place. It's draining us faster than we can recover." Nobara Kujisaki, gripping her hammer tightly, nodded in agreement. "We need a plan. Something she won't see coming." Yuji gritted his teeth, his mind racing. The Mirror Queen had already countered their most powerful techniques, reflecting their attacks back at them with devastating precision. But there had to be a weakness, something they could exploit. "Her reflections," Yuji muttered, his eyes narrowing. "They're not just illusions. They're connected to her. If we can disrupt that connection, maybe we can weaken her." The trio retreated to a hidden alcove, a rare pocket of stability in the chaotic realm. They had no time to waste. Megumi summoned his divine dogs, their spectral forms flickering as they patrolled the perimeter. Nobara began crafting cursed nails infused with her own energy, while Yuji focused on refining his curse technique. He had been experimenting with a new approach, channeling his cursed energy into his fists in a way that created shockwaves upon impact. It was risky. If he lost control, the backlash could cripple him, but they were out of options. As they trained, the oppressive atmosphere of the realm seemed to close in around them, a constant reminder of the urgency of their mission. Hours passed, though time felt distorted in the shadowy realm. Yuji's fists glowed faintly with cursed energy as he practiced his new technique, his movements growing more precise with each repetition. Megumi's shadows expanded, forming intricate patterns that hinted at a deeper understanding of his innate technique. Nobara's cursed nails hummed with power, each one a potential weapon against the Mirror Queen. But even as they grew stronger, the sense of impending doom loomed larger. The Mirror Queen's laughter echoed through the realm, a chilling reminder of her presence. "You can't hide forever," her voice taunted, reverberating through the fractured landscape. "Your fear will consume you before I do." The moment of truth came sooner than they expected. The Mirror Queen's minions, twisted reflections of themselves, emerged from the shadows, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara sprang into action, their training put to the test. Yuji's fist slammed into the ground, sending shockwaves that shattered the reflections before they could fully form. Megumi's divine dogs lunged at the remaining foes, their jaws tearing through the distorted figures with ease. Nobara hurled her cursed nails, each one striking with pinpoint accuracy and disrupting the Mirror Queen's control over her minions. But the victory was short-lived. The Mirror Queen herself appeared, her towering form casting a long shadow over the battlefield. The fight that followed was brutal and chaotic. Yuji charged at the Mirror Queen, his fists blazing with cursed energy. She countered with a wave of her hand, sending a barrage of reflective shards hurtling toward him. He dodged and weaved, his movements fueled by sheer determination. Megumi summoned a massive shadow construct, its form shifting and twisting as it clashed with the Mirror Queen. Nobara focused on disrupting the Queen's connection to her reflections, her cursed nails embedding themselves in the reflective surfaces and causing them to crack and splinter. But the Mirror Queen was relentless. Her attacks grew more ferocious, her laughter echoing through the realm as she toyed with them. As the battle raged on, Yuji noticed something, a faint flicker in the Mirror Queen's reflections whenever Nobara's cursed nails struck. It was a small detail, but it gave him an idea. "Nobara," he shouted, dodging another barrage of shards. "Aim for her core. The center of her reflections." Nobara nodded, her eyes narrowing as she focused her energy. She hurled a cursed nail with all her strength, the projectile streaking through the air and embedding itself in the Mirror Queen's chest. The Queen staggered, her reflective surface cracking and splintering. Yuji seized the opportunity, channeling all his cursed energy into a single, devastating punch. His fist connected with the Mirror Queen's core, the shockwave rippling through the realm and shattering her form into countless fragments. The shadowy realm began to collapse, its oppressive energy dissipating as the Mirror Queen's influence waned. Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara stood amidst the ruins, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. They had faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious, but the cost had been high. The experience had changed them, forging their bond into something stronger and more resilient. As they made their way back to the real world, they knew that the challenges ahead would only grow more daunting. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The air in the shadowy realm was thick with cursed energy, a suffocating pressure that weighed down on Yuji Itadori as he squared off against the Mirror Queen. Her ethereal form shimmered like liquid mercury, reflecting the dim light of the cursed realm, and her piercing gaze seemed to see straight through him. Around them, the battlefield was a chaotic swirl of cursed spirits and shattered mirrors, each shard glinting with malevolent intent. Yuji clenched his fists, his knuckles white, as he prepared for the fight of his life. This was no ordinary opponent, the Mirror Queen was a master of illusions, her cursed technique bending reality itself to her will. But Yuji had no time to hesitate. He charged forward, his movements a blur of speed and precision, his cursed energy flaring like a beacon in the darkness. The Mirror Queen raised a hand, and a wall of mirrors erupted from the ground, their surfaces rippling like water. Yuji's fist collided with the barrier, but instead of shattering, the mirror absorbed his strike, reflecting the force back at him. He barely managed to dodge, the reflected energy grazing his shoulder and leaving a searing burn. Gritting his teeth, Yuji leapt back, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to attack blindly, every move he made could be turned against him. The Mirror Queen smirked, her voice echoing through the realm. "Is this all you have, brat? How disappointing." Yuji's eyes narrowed. He needed a new strategy, and fast. As the Mirror Queen advanced, her movements fluid and hypnotic, Yuji focused on his breathing, channeling his cursed energy into his fists. He remembered the lessons Gojo had drilled into him. Adaptability was key in a fight against a superior opponent. The Mirror Queen swung her arm, and a wave of cursed energy surged toward him, manifesting as a swarm of razor-sharp mirror shards. Yuji leapt into the air, twisting his body to avoid the deadly projectiles. As he landed, he planted his feet firmly and unleashed a devastating punch, aiming not at the Mirror Queen herself, but at the ground beneath her. The force of his strike sent shockwaves rippling through the realm, disrupting the cursed energy that fueled her illusions. The Mirror Queen staggered, her form flickering for a moment, and Yuji seized the opportunity. He closed the distance between them in an instant, his fists a blur as he launched a relentless barrage of attacks. But the Mirror Queen was far from defeated. With a flick of her wrist, she summoned a mirror shield, each of Yuji's strikes absorbed and reflected back at him. He gritted his teeth as the reflected blows landed, each one sending jolts of pain through his body. He needed to push past his limits, to find a way to break through her defenses. Drawing on every ounce of cursed energy he had, Yuji unleashed a devastating black flash, the impact resonating through the realm like a thunderclap. The Mirror Queen's shield shattered, and she was sent flying, her form flickering as she struggled to maintain her composure. But even as Yuji pressed his advantage, he knew this fight was far from over. The Mirror Queen rose to her feet, her expression darkening. "You're stronger than I thought," she admitted, her voice cold. "But strength alone won't save you." She raised both hands, and the realm around them shifted, the ground cracking and splintering as countless mirrors rose from the depths. Each mirror reflected a different version of Yuji, some triumphant, others broken and defeated. The Mirror Queen's voice echoed through the realm. "Which one is the real you, brat? Can you even tell any more?" Yuji felt a pang of doubt, but he shook it off. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He charged forward, his fists glowing with cursed energy, and began smashing through the mirrors one by one. Each shard that fell revealed a glimpse of his past, his fears, his regrets, but Yuji refused to let them hold him back. He was fighting not just for himself, but for his friends, for the future he believed in. As the last mirror shattered, Yuji found himself face to face with the Mirror Queen once more. She was breathing heavily, her form flickering as if on the verge of collapse. But there was a dangerous glint in her eyes, a final trick up her sleeve. "You've pushed me this far," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "But this is where it ends." She raised her hands, and the realm itself seemed to tremble, the cursed energy coalescing into a massive, swirling vortex. Yuji braced himself, his body aching from the countless blows he'd endured. But he couldn't back down now. He focused all of his cursed energy into his fists, his aura blazing like a star in the darkness. This was it, the final clash. The Mirror Queen unleashed the vortex, a tidal wave of cursed energy that threatened to consume everything in its path. Yuji met it head-on, his fists colliding with the energy in a blinding explosion of light and sound. The force of the impact sent shockwaves rippling through the realm, the ground cracking and splintering beneath them. Yuji gritted his teeth, his muscles screaming in protest as he pushed against the overwhelming force. He could feel his cursed energy reaching its limit, but he refused to give in. With a roar, he unleashed everything he had, his fists shattering the vortex and sending the Mirror Queen flying. She landed hard, her form flickering and fading as the realm began to collapse around them. Yuji staggered forward, his body battered and bruised, but his spirit unbroken. He stood over the Mirror Queen, his fists still glowing with cursed energy. "It's over," he said, his voice steady. The Mirror Queen looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence, the only sound the distant rumble of the collapsing realm. Then, with a final, bitter laugh, she dissolved into a cloud of cursed energy, her form fading into nothingness. Yuji let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body trembling with exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. The realm was crumbling, and he needed to find a way out. As he turned to leave, he felt a surge of cursed energy behind him. He spun around, his fists raised, but there was nothing there. Just the faint echo of the Mirror Queen's voice, whispering in the darkness. "This isn't the end, brat. You'll see." Yuji shook off the unease, his focus shifting to the task at hand. He had survived the Mirror Queen's onslaught, but the fight had taken its toll. As he made his way through the collapsing realm, his mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The battles were only getting harder, the stakes higher. But Yuji knew one thing for certain, he would keep fighting, no matter what. For his friends, for the future, and for the belief that even in the darkest of realms, there was always a glimmer of hope. And with that thought, he pressed on, ready to face whatever challenges awaited him. The air in the shadowy realm was thick with cursed energy, a suffocating miasma that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the Mirror Queen herself. Yuji Itadori stood at the center of the chaos, his body battered and his breath ragged, but his resolve unshaken. The Mirror Queen loomed before him, her form shifting and refracting like a shattered prism, each shard reflecting a distorted version of Yuji's own face. Her laughter echoed through the void, a sound that was both mocking and mournful, as if she reveled in the despair she wrought but mourned the inevitability of her own destruction. Yuji clenched his fists, his knuckles white as he channeled every ounce of cursed energy he had left. Sukuna's presence lingered in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the darkness he carried within, but Yuji pushed the cursed king's voice aside. This was his fight, his moment to prove that he could protect the people he cared about, even in the face of overwhelming despair. The Mirror Queen lunged, her movements impossibly fast, her form splitting into a dozen reflections that surrounded Yuji in an instant. Each reflection attacked simultaneously, their strikes precise and deadly, forcing Yuji to rely on instinct alone as he dodged and countered with bursts of cursed energy. The battle was a blur of motion and sound, a symphony of clashing forces that left the shadowy realm trembling. Yuji's body screamed in protest with every movement, his muscles burning and his bones aching, but he refused to falter. He could feel the weight of his friend's hopes resting on his shoulders, Megumi's quiet determination, Nobra's fiery spirit, Gojo's unwavering belief in him. They were counting on him to end this, to shatter the Mirror Queen's illusions and bring light back to this cursed world. The Mirror Queen's attacks grew more frenzied, her movements less controlled as she unleashed the full extent of her power. The ground beneath Yuji's feet cracked and splintered, the air around him warping and twisting as the realm itself began to collapse. Yuji knew he was running out of time. He had to end this now, before the Mirror Queen's madness consumed them both. With a roar of defiance, Yuji surged forward, his cursed energy flaring like a supernova as he delivered a devastating punch to the Mirror Queen's core. The impact was deafening, a shockwave of energy that rippled through the realm and sent both combatants flying. Yuji hit the ground hard, his vision swimming as he struggled to push himself back up. The Mirror Queen staggered, her form flickering and unstable, the cracks in her body spreading like spiderwebs. For a moment, there was silence, a fragile stillness that seemed to hold the weight of the entire world. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, the Mirror Queen shattered, her form dissolving into countless shards that scattered across the void. Yuji collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had done it. He had defeated the Mirror Queen. But as he looked around at the crumbling realm, he realized the cost of his victory. The shadowy realm was collapsing in on itself, the walls of reality folding and twisting as the Mirror Queen's curse unraveled. Yuji knew he had to get out, but his body refused to move. He was spent, his strength completely drained. Just as despair began to creep in, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Yuji. Megumi's voice was strained but determined, and Yuji turned to see his friend standing at the edge of the collapsing realm, his hands glowing with cursed energy. Nobra was beside him, her hammer raised and her eyes blazing with determination. Together, they unleashed a combined attack, their cursed energy weaving together to create a portal that tore through the fabric of the realm. Yuji felt a surge of hope as he forced himself to his feet, stumbling toward the portal with every ounce of strength he had left. The journey back was a blur, a whirlwind of light and sound that left Yuji disoriented and breathless. When he finally emerged on the other side, he found himself back in the real world, surrounded by his friends and allies. The relief on their faces was palpable, but Yuji could see the toll the battle had taken on them as well. Megumi's hands were trembling, his cursed energy nearly depleted, and Nobra's usual fiery demeanor was tempered by exhaustion. But they were alive. They had made it through. As the adrenaline began to fade, Yuji felt the full weight of his injuries and exhaustion crash over him. He sank to the ground, his vision blurring as he struggled to stay conscious. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the concerned faces of his friends, their voices a distant murmur as they called his name. When Yuji awoke, he found himself in a familiar room, the soft hum of medical equipment filling the air. He blinked, his mind sluggish as he tried to piece together what had happened. The battle with the Mirror Queen felt like a distant dream, but the ache in his body was a stark reminder of its reality. He turned his head to see Megumi sitting in a chair beside his bed, his head bowed and his hands clasped together. Nobra was there too, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable but her eyes filled with relief. "You're awake," Megumi said, his voice quiet but steady. "You had us worried for a while there." Yuji managed a weak smile, his throat dry and his voice hoarse. "Sorry about that. I guess I pushed myself a little too hard." Nobra snorted, though there was no real malice in it. "A little too hard? You nearly got yourself killed, idiot. Don't do that again." Yuji chuckled, though it turned into a cough that left him wincing. "I'll try not to." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the weight of everything they had been through hanging in the air. Yuji knew that their victory over the Mirror Queen was just one battle in a much larger war, but for now, they had earned a moment of peace. The world outside was still dangerous, the threats they faced still looming on the horizon, but they had each other. And as long as they had that, Yuji knew they could face whatever came next. As he closed his eyes and let himself drift back into sleep, Yuji felt a sense of quiet determination settle over him. The Mirror Queen was gone, but her defeat had come at a cost. The shadowy realm had been destroyed, but the scars it left behind would linger, a reminder of the darkness they had faced and the strength they had found within themselves. The future was uncertain, but Yuji knew one thing for sure: he would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for the people he cared about. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same unyielding resolve that had carried him through this battle. The world of Jujutsu Kaisen was a dangerous one, filled with curses and chaos, but it was also a world of hope and resilience. And as long as Yuji and his friends stood together, they would continue to shine a light in the darkness, no matter how deep it grew.